Hi everyone, thank you for sacrificing for your Friday evening and coming to my talk. I'd like to thank the Hrant Dink Foundation, Vahagan Keshishian, who invited me, and especially Lara and Navor for making the logistical and travel arrangements. I'm happy to be back to Istanbul despite the complex political situation. Today's talk basically crosses over the two projects. One is materialized in the form of a book that I published in 2017 with Manchester University Press. It's called The Political Aesthetics of the Armenian Avant-garde, The Journey of the Painterly Real, where I discuss the advent of contemporary art in Armenia in late Soviet and post-Soviet period in relation to the constitution of the new liberal democratic state and the difficulty to maintain art's autonomy in the face of the changing reality. And the second one is an ongoing project which is on the temporality of what I call the temporality of contemporaneity or of the contemporary. The quality of historical time today that seems to be standing still, that is presentist. And I trace the advent of this quality of historical time in Stalinism. So you'll get both the worlds today. The first part of the talk is a bit historical and theoretical, but if you survive it, then you'll be rewarded with the second part, which is more about art and artistic practices. Today we begin with a pedestal. And once upon a time, Lenin's statue stood on it in Yerevan, in Lenin Square. After the statue was removed in 1991, in the anti-communist fervor of national liberation, the pedestal remained. Between 91 and 96, several competitions had been announced, first to fill in the material and ideological gap the statue had left, and then to replace the pedestal itself after its demise, its deinstallation in 96. And there were many artistic propositions. One of the notorious ones was by conceptual artist Grigor Khachadrian, who simply stood there, or other artists putting balloons instead of Lenin. The prominent place that Lenin's statue occupied in Lenin Square, subsequently and symptomatically named Republic Square in Yerevan, it's still empty, whereas discussions regarding filling this empty space are ongoing. A contested representational space which has become a symbolic battleground for various narratives of historical past and the ideological present, mostly occupying a pole between patriotic religious nationalism and consumerism, and often for their marriage, is left empty. An emptiness that marks the absence of a compelling ideology and an inability to come to terms with the legacy of the Soviet past within the confines of a belated nation-state in the age of global capital. The gradual disintegration of Lenin's monument in Republic Square, its head housed at the Armenian Museum of History. Actually, recently this photograph resurfaced. I should have brought it of Cher posing next to Lenin in the 90s. Its decapitated body lying in the courtyard of the museum, and the remnants of its pedestal supposedly in municipal storage at the outskirts of Yerevan bears witness to the disintegration of the Soviet historical experience. However, the scattered parts of the monument also signal its subliminal material presence in the subterranean layers of the national post-Soviet present, in the avenues, universities, institutes, museums, abandoned factories, and other infrastructure built throughout the Soviet project of modernization. Discursively, the presence of this ideology is ghostly. On the surface, the Soviet Union is an object of either vilification or nostalgia. And the last material remnants of its modernization project are being, or were being, until the recent revolution in Armenia, wasted away in the hands of the local neo-feudal and Putin-style oligarchy. Let's return to the pedestal. On the other hand, an empty pedestal is neither a complete work of art, unless it's a minimalist object, but it's not, nor representational monument. It's a sort of partial object that sets desire in motion, but is it a desire that is always already for a lost object that can't be recuperated. On the threshold of symbolization, the pedestal awaits to be completed by a signifier, an impossible anticipation. The pedestal is a vessel without content and a support structure waiting to perform a functional role, but at the same time, a symbolic representation cannot fully achieve its function of symbolization without a pedestal, a plinth, a base, a frame that demarcates contingent autonomy from the environment in which it is placed. Now it would be naive to assume, as many in the burgeoning field of memory studies of the post-Soviet scholarship have, that the destruction of the statue itself signifies the ultimate collapse of the Leninist project of attaining the communist ideal. This assumption reveals a first-degree naivete. The Lenin we used to get in squares, parks, factories, cafeterias, cultural houses was Stalin's Lenin, already petrified, always with an erect posture, with his hand stretched out in a gesture of reaching the masses, a too familiar image that forged iconographic orthodoxy throughout Stalinist Socialist Realism and beyond. The Lenin we used to get in schools, metro stations, airports, concert halls, was the Lenin of the Stalinist epic history, deadened but not buried, literally. You know, the body of Lenin is still in Moscow. And Marx's formulation in the 1945 German ideology in the context of the revolutions in thought that were sweeping Germany in the wake of Hegelian philosophy applies here as well. And I quote Marx, "Certainly it is an interesting event we are dealing with, the putrescence of the absolute spirit. When the last spark of its life has failed, the various components of this caput mortuum began to decompose, entered into new combinations, and forged new substances." End of quote. So the Bolshevik project disintegrates, and that's my argument, with Stalinism and beyond. And the decomposition of the communist ideal, like Hegel's absolute spirit, embodied in the Leninist project, becomes a prolonged and material process akin to a corpse that generates various fermentations. The last disappearance in a long chain of disappearances of the revolutionary project launched by the October 1917 revolution is the dismemberment of the statue that I talked about, wherein the surviving pedestal stands for a double end of history, both the end of the Stalinist version of epic history as a successive chain of victorious events led by exceptional leaders, and the end of this conception of epic history itself with the triumphant arrival of neoliberal capitalism and market economy, coupled with a postmodern end of history and epitomized in Francis Fukuyama's famous declaration, "The history has ended and liberal democracy has won." Actually, it's quite ironic that recently Fukuyama announced that we ought to go back to socialism. Let's postpone the end of history. It is upon this ideology of the end of history, or the end of battling ideologies, that contemporary art arrives to late Soviet and post-Soviet Armenia on the wings of market economy and liberal democracy. But contemporary art itself is grounded upon an epochal contemporaneity. Contemporaneity is an epochal world historical notion, as what one of the theorists of, or art critics of the contemporary, Terry Smith, calls a permanent seeming aftermath. An aftermath of the end of history that seems permanent when time is stuck, it doesn't move, there is no political futurity. And the horizon of wholesale social transformation is forsaken for the new shiny products promising consumer wish fulfillment. But what I argue is that the contemporary as an epochal designation does not merely arrive in the post-Soviet space after the collapse of the USSR. Rather, the contemporary is a juxtaposition of two modalities of time. The deadening of historical, that is the deadening of historical time. The first marked by the defeat of the Leninist revolutionary project of 1917 by Stalinism, and the second, the advent of global capitalist contemporaneity on the wings of neoliberalization since the 90s. Then the postmodern version of the end of history did not merely arrive as a global condition with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the bipolar world order, but had been prepared in the long processes of the disintegration of the Leninist project by Stalinism and post-Stalinism. The Stalinist regime of deadlines, and this is something that art historian Vartan Azatian argues, implemented an economic imperative since the first 5-year plans in 1928. These 5-year plans were sort of like teleologically planned central economic systems where the goals of production were announced in the beginning, and then the reality had to accelerate to match the goals that were set up for production. And of course, the first 5-year plan was marked by forced, brutal collectivization, by constructing large-scale industry, and also by the cultural revolution orchestrated by a group of proletarian writers and artists known as Prolet Cult. So with the socialist state declared as the final arrival of socialism, socialism is completed, a modality of time arrives with Stalinism that replaced the Leninist revolutionary and historical temporality and spatialized and effectively spatialized time in the factory space, in the agricultural collective farms, in the space of the Soviet state, and in the monumentalized ideal of the Soviet man. So what I want to argue today, I want to develop an understanding of the post-Soviet contemporary as one that has arrived through the longue durée of the disintegration of the Leninist revolutionary time. Further, I look at the ways in which the advent of neoliberal contemporary art in the Soviet sphere is preconditioned upon the ghostly reverberations of that which signified the Soviet. The Soviet here functioned as that which needed to be repressed by signs, lifestyles, and behaviors of all sorts that signified the non-Soviet, that which was the other of the Soviet. This is the moment when the two mentioned modalities of the contemporary, the Soviet one and the late capitalist spatialization of time, coincide and overlap. Then what were the contours of historical time punctured and enabled by revolutionary rupture that I claim entered the long process of disintegration since Stalinism? In the aftermath of the historical moment of 1917 and the subsequent war communism, and as the Soviet 20s were descending, it was becoming increasingly clear that the world revolution was not on the immediate horizon, especially with the defeat of the German Revolution. And the course of Soviet political economy itself had to be revisited under this light. The fervent antagonistic rhetoric of the late teens in post-revolutionary Russia, with its cultural wing of militant avant-gardism, gave way to the conception of class antagonism, not only as one between classes, but also within classes themselves. The 1921 new economic policy that Lenin launched, this was a year prior to the declaration of the USSR as a state, introduced elements of the bourgeois mode of production within the socialist economy. Ultimately, the new economic policy was not Lenin's deviation from the course of historical materialism, but in a way its conformation. The very Marxian conception of history, as it was implemented by Lenin in a revolutionary situation, conceived of historical time in terms of heterogeneity, wherein the older modes of production continued their withering afterlife in a temporality punctured by the revolution. NEP can be understood as the economic equivalent of Lenin's withering away of the state, that the state ultimately needs to give away to a communal organization of social labor and socialization of products of labor. What NEP proposed was a temporary economy of time within the fast-racing revolutionary temporality of historical change. The withering away of the state is precisely about using the remnants of the older apparatus towards a new social order that the NEP institutionalized at the level of economic policy. That means calling in the fellow travelers who are not necessarily Bolsheviks or communists to come and embark upon the construction of the new culture and the new state. Art historian Vartan Azatian analyzes the cultural politics of the Bolshevik 20s in terms of NEP's economy of time that generated a time economy regarding the past in the sphere of culture. This entailed that those progressive elements within the antagonistic classes, the fellow travelers, were called upon to assist in the construction of the new historical world. This also entailed utilizing select elements of tradition towards this end. NEP's temporality, as Azatian argues, was that of a dialectically continuous time flow, and it developed complex confrontations with a defeated but not annihilated tradition. So as opposed to some of the avant-garde rhetoric that the past is evil and evil is past, and we need to start from tabula rasa, from a blank page, there's a complex conversation with the past and with tradition that took place in the Soviet 20s. But what I argue is that with the implementation of the first 5-year plan in 1928 by Stalin, the cancellation of NEP, and the emerging doctrine of socialism in one country, the heterogeneous temporality of NEP starts giving way to the escalation of class struggle under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Stalin's great turn in 1928, facilitated by the avant-garde cadres of the first properly official Soviet institutions, Vhutemas, Inhuk, other kind of technical art collectives and institutions, ranged a fierce battle against the cultural policies of NEP and its selective appropriation of tradition. Now it was time for properly proletarian art that was to be uncompromising in terms of its fidelity to a class. And Stalin used to say, class is class, comrades, you cannot get away from it. This does not mean that the form of class struggle itself persisted, but rather it became a minimum ideological content to be implemented as a weapon against the heretical enemy, both within and from without, the national deviationist, liberal bourgeoisie, and so on. The first 5-year plans were implemented in what Azatian calls a regime of deadlines, production deadlines, and I argue this reverberates today with a kind of neoliberal deadlines and the management of time. And this replaced historical time with timing that expelled time from social life. Azatian says that in Stalinist politics, there was no time but timing, which itself should be overcome by its even more accelerated modality, planning. Whereas NEP relied on historical consciousness, Stalinism relied on deadline consciousness. Within Stalinist imperatives, there was no time to give space to time. But this avant-gardist fervor was too one-sided, hence Stalin's second turn in 1932, where NEP's policies and the culture it generated was seen as precursors to Stalin's own cultural politics. So what happened is that the avant-garde cadres, the prolet cult, were called upon to launch a battle against the traditionalists, the fellow travelers, and then now, during Stalin's second turn, more towards traditional culture, building the Soviet culture by appropriating, creating a pastiche from traditions, it was time to destroy the prolet cult. So first we have the critique and destruction of NEP, and then we have its cultural and rhetorical appropriation to annihilate the proletarian artists and writers known as the prolet cult. NEP's cultural politics is repeated in the Stalinist 30s as tragedy, comedy, and farce all at once. Now, the cultural policy of the NEP was brought to oppose the avant-garde, that is the very same Soviet cadres of the Great Turn of the late 20s that had fought NEP and its cultural politics. The avant-garde of the Great Turn was sacrificed on the altar of Soviet culture, and we can say of the concept of the Soviet man that arrived, both figuratively since 1936, with the Soviet constitution, literally. So the final nail in the coffin of the heterogeneous and complex temporality of the early Bolshevik years was the 1938 publication, History of the Bolshevik Party of the Soviet Union, written by re-educated and reformed historians, a book that was full of falsifications, where Trotsky, Bukharin, all of them who were already destroyed and annihilated, appeared as people's enemies from the very beginning, and Stalin presented himself as Lenin's right-hand man throughout the revolution. And Stalin himself wrote the article on dialectical materialism for this textbook. It was published by the end of Stalin's life, 1953. It was published in around 45 million copies, both in the USSR and in multiple languages. So with the Stalinist specialization of time in the Soviet state and the party, a notion of the contemporary, Современность in Russian, is established at the ideological level as a permanent seeming aftermath, since history has been fulfilled in the triumph of the communist party state. There is no communist horizon, we have a socialist state, the time is frozen, and so on. Even with de-Stalinization since 1956, the conception of the Soviet state as the ultimate embodiment of the triumph of a historical movement persists. The historical temporality frozen on the space of the state as the result of the fulfillment of historical necessity is anchored on the contemporary, on the conception of synchronicity between the means of production, relations of production, and to a certain degree of consciousness. There was a famous saying that in Brezhnev's time of developed socialism, everyone pretends that the train of history is moving, but the train is actually standing still. This ideological conception stemming from the Soviet nomenclature was precisely what was countered by the dissident intelligentsia that acquired a public platform during Gorbachev's program of perestroika and glasnost in the 80s, during the processes of liberalization of culture and economy, and attempts to reform the bureaucratic party apparatus. To break from the official orthodoxy, the unofficial artists sought a rupture from the permanent triumph of history in the other space, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, in the consumer paradise of capitalist democracies. But this rupture was a spatial rather than a temporal one. It wasn't a revolutionary rupture in terms of an indeterminate negation of what exists. Instead, it was a determinate negation, since the futurity that the perestroika avant-gardes, artists and intellectuals inspired by Gorbachev's promise of liberalization and reform, launched a wholesale attack against the Soviet institutions, envisioned this kind of futurity was a spatial futurity because it existed on the other side of the Iron Curtain in the liberal democracies of the capitalist West. Perestroika's cultural and intellectual avant-garde imagined the content of the new contemporary in the freedoms and lifestyles denoting the non-Soviet. Nevertheless, at the structural level, the seemingly new contemporary prepared in the interstices of the Soviet experience and made visible because of glasnost's attempt or call for transparency and freedom of speech rhymes with the Soviet establishment's contemporary in which historical time acquires spatial qualities. I argue that the late Soviet and post-Soviet contemporary are made visible through artistic practices that make the anti-Soviet, that take the anti-Soviet consciousness as a prerequisite for the new era. This era itself being constituted through the Stalinist and post-Stalinist contemporary, and that of the new era of neoliberalization. To be contemporary in the post-Soviet space means to treat the Soviet historical experience as a ghost to be expelled. So the contemporary is everything that the Soviet is not. The Soviet haunted the practices of semi- and unofficial artists in Soviet Armenia through recurrent returns of various invented and real personages born from the anti-Soviet consciousness. And this is already the art part, so thank you for surviving the long historical detour. Sometimes these personages occupied the margins of official discourses, styles, forms, and techniques. At other times, they hid underground from the watchful eyes of the Soviet collective consciousness. So I trace the advent of contemporary art in Armenia in the practices of late 1980s and 90s cultural movement called the third floor, wherein contemporary art is established through the exorcism of the Soviet. And it is my argument that the contemporary art in Armenia can be located in the intersection between what was perceived by the community of young artists of the Perestroika generation as a dream world of Western liberal freedom and consumer culture, and late Soviet countercultures of various youth movements. And actually the same treatment of the Soviet as a historical, as a ghost to be expelled can be also traced in unofficial practices of Russian artists. I'll not go into this today, like Ilya Kabakov, especially his installation, The Man Who Flew into Space. It's basically a room with a hole in the ceiling, and the idea is that the man catapulted himself into space to disappear from the watchful eyes of the KGB. Or by this movement in St. Petersburg, cinematic movement called Necrorealism, established by Yevgeny Yufit and Andrei Maslov, that worked a lot with zombies, living dead that come to haunt, that come to signify the dead but not buried ideology. So let's return to the third floor. Inspired by Mikhail Gorbachev's program of Perestroika and its appeal to glasnost, transparency, a group of young artists in Armenia embarked upon the reformation of the local Union of Artists. The first event was more of a festival, then a coherent exhibition, and it took place in the conference hall located on the third floor of the Union of Artists, a space not designated for exhibitions, and hence comes the name of the group or cultural movement, the third floor. The third floor began to form when several young artists were invited to be part of the youth division of the Union of Artists in 1987. They had a mandate to organize and provide content for the annual youth exhibition, which would attract a large public and breathing a fresh gasp of air into an otherwise stagnant institution, a bastion of official Soviet art. So they were just invited to revive the space because the Union of Artists were highly centralized and bureaucratic institutions reproducing kind of cliches of socialist realism over and over again. So some of the Gorbachev's calls for transparency inspired these institutions to open up. So they're not exactly dissident because they kind of occupied the margins of the official institution. So for the translator, I'll skip one paragraph. We go to page 8, the second. So the establishment of the third floor at the margins of the Union of Artists institutional structure in 1987 was the result of a change of a statute that led to the inclusion of several soon-to-be artists of the movement as part of the Union's youth section. The incorporation in the official art institution, while it they continued to act at its margins as the cultural vanguard of the new epoch, put them in the trajectory of the discourse of glasnost as part of the official perestroika reforms that aimed at giving voice to the intelligentsia alienated by stagnant bureaucracy. The exhibitions organized by the third floor were all-inclusive, performative, and time-based. They had this event structure operating within the regime of urgency. It has to be done now, it has to be done today. It's very presentist. As the ideologue of the group and one of the key artists, Armand Grigorian, declared in 1989, he said, art should be urgent and not leave anyone indifferent. The young artists associated with the third floor used the opportunity to be officially part of the Soviet artistic establishment, placing at the heart of their agenda the issue of direct communication with the public and debureaucratization of arts distribution, without juries, without curators. They were their own curators. They challenged the traditional representational content of the Union's youth exhibitions, which provided opportunities to young artists to exhibit as long as they affirmed and reproduced the inherent styles, techniques, and rules of composition that exclusively favored figuration, or national modernism. Modernist in form, national in content. The young artists involved in the movement aimed at nothing less than institutional transformation, and by extension, a redefinition of art itself. For instance, in this action, Nazaret Karayan was an art critic of the group, and back then an aspiring conceptual artist, collected the garbage from the rooftop of the Modern Art Museum and categorized garbage meticulously and presented it during one of the meetings of the Artists' Union, and they were scandalized. And of course, it's a metaphor that beyond this very shiny facade, it's all shit. Sorry, it's all garbage. So the artists of the third floor challenged the traditional representational content of the Union's youth exhibitions, which provided opportunities to. No, I read this. Sorry. So the artists, Armand Grigorian, Kiki, or Grigor Mikhailian, art critic Nazaret Karayan, took advantage of the Union of Artists' 1987 invitation and organized a 10-day process-based event where, I quote them, anyone and anybody could present themselves or be presented as artists, stressing the urgency of communication, which can only be resolved between art and reality. It was from their manifesto. In this way, they opposed and critiqued the established Union of Artists policies of selecting the participating artists for annual youth exhibitions exclusively through state-organized committees, aiming thus at reforming the very institutional structure of the Union in terms of its politics, institutional politics, as well as aesthetics. Ideologically, the third floor movement presented a mixture of romantic liberalism, nationalism, libertarianism, with anarchist dreams of omnipotence and contradicting ideologies that often worked hand in hand. It is not accidental that throughout the 6 years of its loose existence, the group dissolved in 1994. About 50 artists participated in their events. Through its broad strategies, which bring to mind the Wagnerian notion of Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, the third floor had an ambition to make up for the lack of contemporary art discourse by means of a limited number of exhibitions. The artists participating in the movement utilized and appropriated Western signs and symbols that were often a mixture of high art and middle or to low-brow cultural icons. From Joseph Beuys to Black Sabbath, the rock band, to the veneration of American blue jeans and Marlboro cigarettes. The members romanticized the symbols to the degree that they came to denote ideals of individual freedom and autonomy. The critique of the Soviet through its opposite other, signs of bourgeois consumer culture, situates the third floor within the intellectual climate of the late Soviet and socialist intelligentsia's romantic alliance with bourgeois democracy. In the practices of the third floor, These ideals were understood as an artistic perspective, from an artistic perspective. The citizen's freedom was equal to the artist's absolute and universal right to mix different artistic styles, images on the surface of the canvas. For the third floor, autonomy meant precisely this right to mix images and styles of high and low culture. Or also, in a sense, the exhibition or the canvas becomes a dream world. For example, in Armand Grigorian's work, he was presenting like these fictitious paintings. For example, a nudist parade in Gyumri, in Leninakan, which cannot exist. It's a very conservative city. Or gay liberation in one of the villages in Armenia. So like the canvas becomes kind of this dream world of oppressed subjects, in a sense. For the third floor, autonomy meant the aesthetic right, yes, to mix images and styles of high and low culture. This aesthetic eclecticism that formed the core of this artistic movement and its method of exhibition making was combined with the relativization of all value and the dismantling of hierarchies. This anarchic impulse corresponds to the then ongoing constitution of the late Soviet subject as an autonomous agent devoid of social responsibility. In opposition to the collective subject produced in Soviet ideological discourse, the third floor insisted on individualism. In their war against banality, be it ideological banality or everyday life, they insisted on being uncommon. The third floor stretched the very borders of art practice to include poetry readings, music performances, even breakdance. A poster painting prepared for a 1987 exhibition, for example, announces the following events taking place throughout the duration of the exhibition. I quote, a meeting with painters and breakdancers, a meeting with the composers of the Philharmonic, poetry, jazz, avant-garde, and so on. In Armenia, the third floor's understanding of art as a sphere of dreaming about political and social ideals, has become paradigmatic or even synonymous with contemporary art as such. And here, painting served as a conduit to these ideals. That which cannot be realized in the social sphere can be realized in painting or in artistic practice as such. It is not unimportant that this very large poster announcing the exhibition was a large painting. But what encapsulates the third floor's political agenda, apart from the direct appropriation of images, techniques, and gestures from the other side of the increasingly porous Iron Curtain, was a seminal happening in 1988. In the fall of that year, the third floor artists dressed as resurrected ghosts, like their heavy metal heroes, the musicians from the groups Black Sabbath and Kiss, and rock, we know, played a huge role in Perestroika youth culture, walked into one of the Union of Artists' conventional exhibitions and declared the death of official art. In this happening, recorded under two different titles, The Official Art Has Died and Hail to the Union of Artists from the Netherworld, these countercultural heroes walked silently through the exhibition hall, viewed traditional paintings hung on the walls of an art institution defending Soviet official orthodoxy, and with the realization of the symptomatic significance of their action, took photographs of themselves in various groupings and positions, and silently walked out. This event crystallized the third floor's belief in the incommensurability of art as a space for free creation and the institution ruled by banality. If art was the collectively constructed dream of the underground heroes, the institution was the conventional domain of a properly dead and officially sanctioned reality. The dead heroes of the netherworld were more alive than what belonged to the social world above the ground. By mobilizing the metaphor of the netherworld, the third floor artists strove to discover the pure, socially unconditioned freedom of a radically individualized subject who had managed to overcome the contaminating layers of ideology. And this liberation was possible on the surface of the canvas and by extent in the space of the exhibition. So the exhibition is a sort of a cathartic place to expel the Soviet ghosts. The movement's aesthetics of bright colors, huge brushstrokes, large canvases, expressive gestures, assemblages of random objects, interesting garbage as material, some of which I've shown, and the theatrical pathos conceived of art as a waking dream, channeling fantasies upon everything, betokening the non-Soviet, consumer products, ideologies, technologies, artistic styles, where Leonardo, Cadillac, and Madonna appear on the same surface. The Soviet reoccurred in the haunted figures of resurrected ghosts and authoritarian personages, such as a personage found in the work of artist Grigor Khachaturian, known as Kiki. The personage is called Bobo. So Bobo is an abstract and fictional character without a referent in real life, whose name is commonly used to evoke scare in children. In Kiki's series of abstract paintings that he has been tirelessly producing since the late mid-80s, and he still does so, Bobo is the secret agent, the KGB officer, and the immaterial eye that controls. It is the scarecrow of the official, of the dissident intelligentsia. Bobo is also a doubling at the linguistic level, Bobo. It's a figure of a paradox, an image and an anti-image, a hero and anti-hero, an abstraction, but a material one. This figure had to be constantly reconstituted, constantly in process. It is not accidental that Bobo could only materialize through action painting, enacted on a canvas spread on the floor, with action painting and abstraction being prime signifiers of opposition to the Soviet and its cultural politics. Of course, references to Jackson Pollock, but Kiki was using more innovative technologies, we'll see. So the horizontally positioned canvas itself became a site of exorcism of the official and of the ideological as the artist circled around in mad movements and through scribbly brushstrokes, or rather broomstrokes. So he was using a broom, as you can see here, like, you know, that favorite vehicle for transportation of the witches. So he was throwing paint with a broom on the surface of the canvas with intense gestures. Thus, Bobo is a figure, or rather an anti-figure of official discourse. The canvas appears as a space of psychic discharge upon which repressed demons are exorcised. Perestroika intended precisely to overcome those demons of the Soviet system and of Stalinism in particular through publicly orchestrated collective exorcism. However, this exorcism turned Soviet history into a double ghost. As a historical experience, this history had already been rendered spectral by Stalinism, as I tried to argue earlier, whereas Perestroika was fighting the ghost that had left the material body of this experience while deceiving its enemies with the empty shell that remained. So the Soviet, since Stalinism has been evacuated of the Soviet, that's my claim. It is rather telling that death, the netherworld, the uncanny cohabitation of the living and dead as signifiers of the decaying communist project and the disintegrating Soviet ideology became frequent figures in the art practices of the perestroika and immediate post-Soviet period. In a way, we still live in the nightmare dreamed by the third floor, a dream materialized in the triumph of consumerism, but also as a wish that has yet to be fulfilled. If the third floor artists, as anti-Soviet heroes of the netherworld, dreamt of freedom of choice, lifestyle, and gestures, this dream is actualized today as a nightmare in the image of the ever-happy consumer, leaving the former third floor artists on the very margins of this very new order. The contemporary in the post-Soviet context is an amalgam of different temporalities at first sight, diametrically opposed. The eternal time of the primordial ethnic nation, the Stalinist territorialization of time in the regime of deadlines and central planning, and the permanent present of neoliberal globalization with its time management economy. Actually, this is Mother Armenia behind the Kardashians. Of course, you can see it's a very masculine woman with a sword, of course, looking towards your direction. But the interesting story is that it came to replace Stalin. And the pedestal is still the same that housed Stalin until de-Stalinization in 1956. But all these moments of contemporary temporality conversing today are qualitatively on the same plane, marking the ideology of the post-historical stage that has gradually arrived to the Soviet space since the 30s, since Stalinism. In a way, the post-Soviet contemporary is the post-Stalinist living on of Stalinism. And I want to quote one guy that I don't like at all, Charles de Gaulle. On Stalin's obituary, he said one thing that really resonates strongly today. He said, Stalin did not die, he dissolved into our future. And our future is today. Sorry. In a way, the post-Soviet contemporary is the post-Stalinist living on of Stalinism. But underneath the surface of this neoliberal post-Stalinist present lingers the repressed modality of the revolutionary time of the Soviet 20s, dormant in the KGB dungeons, uncovered and unrecoverable archives in buildings on which the names of those who carried forth this historical temporality are unwittingly preserved, and in the material traces of modernization. Might the historicity of the contemporary through the embodied presence of the hunting dead and the presence of the forever new point towards a buried temporality that is more alive than the contemporary time of today's permanent present? And before I finish, I'm ending it with this slide. It's the first Armenian translation of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, by Tadevos Avdalbekian. You might notice a very peculiar thing here. The names are deleted, the names of the translator and the editors. Actually, the first volume came out in 1933. Then the second, followed by the second and the third. And then all of this publication was confiscated by Stalin because it's a monumental translation of Capital that also establishes Armenian as a modern philosophical language for the first time in a sense. So the Stalinist argument would be, who are you Armenians to translate from German? You have to translate from Russian, from an already bastardized translation. So yeah, I managed to get my own copy of Avdalbekian's translation. So I'll